So this is really about how coaching ourselves works as a practice deeply embedded in organizational processes for connecting. And connecting is especially important given the terrible predicament we are now in. You may be familiar with this image, which was published about 4 weeks ago. And it refers to tipping cascades in relation to climate change. Now, previously, we have been familiar with the idea of tipping points, where a particular climatic system reaches a level at which it's unable to control itself through negative feedback. And what this paper is showing is that some effects will take place at a relatively low level of global warming, average global temperatures of 1 to 3 degrees Celsius. And these are the yellow figures in the picture here. As you know, we are already above 1 degree of global warming. And the Paris Accord is hoping, if everybody lives by it, to limit warming to 2 degrees. But even at this level, the coral reefs, alpine glaciers, Arctic summer sea ice, Greenland ice sheet, and the West Antarctic ice sheet will all be critically disturbed. And there's a big risk that as they slip into entropy, they will cause further, they will cascade their effect into effects on the brown-colored systems here in the Sahel, the thermalahine circulation, the jet stream, and so on. So, and these in turn will tip the red one, the really serious East Antarctic ice sheet, the permafrost, and the Arctic winter sea ice, which are systems at risk nominally with a much higher temperature change, but which could cascade into collapse. So the circumstances in which our global life are now terribly unstable and uncertain. And I think we can see the effects of this existential anxiety in many aspects of contemporary life, and especially attitudes towards leadership. It seems that we are facing something like this classical monster, the Hydra. Here we see Hercules, the hero soul, fighting this monster, which every time he cut off one head, 2 more would grow in its place. And eventually he controlled this with the help of his friend, his charioteer, Iolaus. And in the top right-hand corner, you can see Iolaus cauterizing, sealing the heads, while every time Hercules would cut one, to control this monster, which just got worse and worse. So we are, of course, culturally, we are seeking some force, some hero force, to control this monster which we are releasing. And often we look to some kind of magical leader like Dumbledore from Harry Potter, who is able to manage both the human world and the natural world and the supernatural world, and to create from these out of control forces something an environment in which people can grow and can live a civilized life. However, I think most of us are feeling that the hope for a global Dumbledore is a vain hope. We're not going to have someone like Dumbledore come to rescue us. And this picture from the British graffiti artist Banksy, I think expresses what many people, and especially many young people, are feeling about the kind of world they are inheriting. And at the level of decision makers, both in politics and in corporate life, we see a rather dysfunctional set of activities. This painting, actually from the 1890s, it's about 130 years ago now, 120 years ago, shows people from many different parts of the world meeting and having a lovely party on a boat. But if you look at the faces, you'll see they're not really having such a great time. In fact, they don't seem to quite be entering the spirit of the party which is going on behind them. Each of them has their mind full of their own concerns. They're not able to talk to each other about these. They're happening inside, is an interior dialogue happening. It's actually a picture that should be of a happy party, and there does seem to be some happiness in the background, but the figures in the foreground are very anxious and perhaps in search of some kind of leadership. But they don't seem to really know where to look for this. And I think it expresses also our own predicament, the situation that we are in these days, in modern times. And this is not really surprising when you think of how we experience our leaders. This wordle, this slide, shows the answers from academics in mainly British, not completely, but Anglophone universities, when they were asked to describe the characteristic traits or behaviors that describe their academic leaders. And I'll give you a few moments to read this. And I think this is a very significant slide and image because it shows us that when people look to their actual experience of their leaders and managers, they have a very ambivalent view about the traits which make up actual leadership. Of course, these traits, which you can read, they include things like being self-centered, dogmatic, ruthless, lacking integrity, unable to accept criticism, willing to push papers and invent forms, but not prepared to rock the boat, and so on. These are quite negative qualities. They express a degree of skepticism about the character of the people who are in charge of their bosses. This is very different to the wishful thinking lists of qualities of leaders. So often consulting companies and many of us, myself too, say things like, we need leaders to be adaptive, decisive, visionary, great listeners, and so on. But this is existing in a make-believe world. In the real world, this is how organizational members analyze and experience their own bosses. So it's not surprising that people are unsure of where their savior, as it were, might come from. And they are understandably skeptical about leadership and leadership development in the traditional form. And we can see the split between that experience and the way in which management is talked about in this kind of very typical change management diagram. This is presenting a cascade of change from an executive board that sponsors it, a middle or senior management agent who is driving an organizational change, and then the change subjects, those people to whom it is done, who have to accept what's done one way or another, who are to be changed. Well, if people believe these things about their managers, it's not surprising they are skeptical and resistant about these kinds of processes. And so many people are living their lives in organizations in a kind of disconnected state in which they don't really find themselves or anybody else to connect with, to link with, to have a kind of conversation with. And performance management processes involve this kind of pact where you accept that you will undertake some probably impossible or near impossible job, and that you will be held accountable for it. Managers and their reports are, I think, often like these two characters, locked into a kind of interdependence, but with a rather one-sided risk. And this is an environment that is made even worse when the external environment also seems to be so uncertain and risky. But people in taking power and coming up the managerial ladder, advancing their career, inevitably have to find some kind of satisfaction in this sort of system, these sorts of roles. But let's contrast that with another set of questions to the academics, and I think it's the same in most, especially professional organizations, is who do people actually look to for leadership? That is, for who do they feel really influences their decisions, their choices, their sense of what makes good work? And you can see for academics here, the biggest source of leadership is their colleagues, and also their former colleagues, their former PhD supervisors, their line managers to some extent, but former senior colleagues, former university tutors, a former head of department. It's very interesting how in this list of people who provide leadership, the academics are referring to kind of internal figures, people in their heads who they are imagining and remembering as having established quality standards for them. And when we undertook this research into academic leadership, I was very surprised to find that many people in their later parts of their career, in their 60s, when you ask them who really has an influence on how you prioritize your work, on what counts as good work, on how to behave with other colleagues in the department, on what is the purpose of a university, many of them referred to their PhD supervisors, who they had not worked with for the previous 30 or 40 years. And in fact, quite a few people described their leaders, well, actually, they described the people they follow in their academic work as academics and scientists of previous eras, people who were long time dead. So we have a mismatch between the processes of managing, which are risky and individualized and linear, and the experience of where leadership comes from, which is an internal identity-related dialogue. People are talking within themselves, but who is influencing me? Who is teaching me? Who is a model of the good? Who is a good worker or professional in my work or life. Now, these findings, knew that this data from work at academics, but these findings are replicated in most other professions, and especially so in healthcare, and also across private and public sector. So we see when there is slightly more sophisticated change management models begin to look something like this, where there is a recognition that the people at the bottom respect their colleagues and want to fit in with their colleagues and be members of colleagueship, of a shared collective identity, not simply to receive instructions from their line management. So the more sophisticated change management models begin to look now at the importance of engaging the staff at the working level. But nonetheless, this engagement is still very much about people appreciating and understanding and aligning themselves with the message which is coming from above. So the processes of driving change and of facilitating change management are really processes of aligning the whole hierarchy to the direction which is coming from the top. And here is a picture of a group of people receiving their information about organizational change, which has come through in an email or a handout, and now they're reading the news and the information. There is very little opportunity for them to have any input into this, but at least somebody is giving them some information about something. So let's have a look at why people get involved in management, given that it has such a tainted and ambivalent kind of respect within organizations. This is coming from research questions I've been asking people about this question, really asking, why do you want to do these jobs? What's the pleasure you get from it? And some people say they get simply pleasure from moving on, from progress, that to advance their career is in itself a pleasurable and interesting, exciting thing to do. Some say they like to define the agenda. They like a sense that they have the opportunity now to say what it is that's important, what should have priority. So they're task focused and want to make some things happen. And that in itself gives a feeling of satisfaction. Some people say they really like a systemic perspective, having a wide of the whole. So as they come up a hierarchy, they're able to see more broadly what's going on and have a bigger understanding of what's happening and how things interact. And they find that intellectually interesting and aesthetically satisfying. Like, to get that bigger picture is a satisfying thing. Some people enjoy being able to interpret to one part of the organization what is happening in the rest of it, so that because they sit somewhere high up the hierarchy, they can tell part A what is going on in part B. They can communicate across the silos, and this gives them, of course, some sense of power and superiority, and it also is intellectually interesting to tell the story and to interpret and translate across an organization. Many people say they like to have greater respect from others. They like more status and everything that goes with it. And that's a pleasure that comes from the work. And you can see in how many organizations that becoming more senior gives a bigger title and a different place on an organization chart, but almost no more money or real influence. But the status becomes important. The title is important. For some people, I think many people, a sense of modified self-image how they see themselves is very important. So to go up the ladder, to be more senior, to have a more systemic perspective, all these other things go together. They are pleasurable because they affirm something about themselves. They make their self-esteem better, and that's a pleasurable experience. For some, maybe many people, there is a full sensuous satisfaction in having more power. For some, it's the deep carpet in their executive office, or the fancy clothes they can wear, the style they adopt. And for some, it's the experience of driving a more powerful car. There's an interesting piece of data, an interesting finding that chief executives do 4 things when they get appointed. They buy a new wardrobe, new clothes. They redecorate the executive office. They reorganize the top team, and they buy a more powerful car. And the more powerful car is not just because it's new or the brand is great. It's because the physical feeling of power when they put their foot on the accelerator is affirming something about their image, how they feel themselves. Of course, the reality of many senior jobs is that you don't get a great feeling of power most of the time. You're constantly being bombarded. But nonetheless, there is something about winning and succeeding which makes you feel different in your body. And any of you who are involved in sport will know that when you finish a game and you lose, it might be a great game, but you feel completely different if you win. And you feel different in your whole body. Some people really enjoy the sense that some rather ordinary human qualities become reified when they become seen. So, for example, if a leader is seen as a good listener, that's considered to be a remarkable thing. Wow, fantastic! He's a great listener. But really, if somebody else is a great listener, they're a great listener. That's good. And if somebody is a great communicator, or they give terrific speeches, or they have tremendous vision, if they're a leader with those things, they become somehow sparkly in a way that they're not when one is more junior or not involved in that kind of power game. And so the rather ordinary aspects of being a competent human being become something like an aura around the leader, which is a slightly strange thing, but I think people like the feeling of being sort of superhuman in some way that comes with it, and the ordinary is transmuted into the superhuman. And of course, more money and power. Now, what is interesting about all of these pleasures is they're all about the individual, how the person feels. And we can see that so much of many of the systems and processes in organizational life are oriented to satisfying and fulfilling these pleasures, even when they are dysfunctional. So, for example, when we come to that pyramid describing the communication of change, or change program, it's all about cascading downwards so that the people at the bottom receive all these good things, i.e. information, a newsletter, a printout, but the people above all feel great for knowing more, and for being in the position to hand out these things. It's all about satisfying the power pleasures of the individuals up the ladder. But it's not really about engaging the people. Now, the final significant pleasure here is what I call disciplines of the self. And this is very interesting because this is a term taken from Michel Foucault, and before him from Epictetus. because many people I've interviewed and some I've studied in depth, following them around and looking at how they work, face terrible difficulties and predicaments. It's really hard work being a manager. And one of the things they describe is how they discipline and contain their individual personal pleasures in the interests of the role and the work they're doing. So they take pleasure in disciplining and containing, in limiting these pleasures for some collective purpose. And I guess many of us will recognize this sense of managing. There is a pleasure and a satisfaction in managing oneself appropriately in a role, And for any of you who are working as executive coaches in this kind of world, coaching people on how to take up their role, how to take the best advantage of their role, in effect, what you're doing is helping them in the discipline of the self, helping them to discipline themselves and all that they are in the context of that role. This is a very classical kind of thing. Of course, it's very common in spiritual and self-improvement traditions all around the world, in sort of Western and European philosophy. It's really exemplified by the Stoics, by Stoicism. Now, I want to show how this works out, or everything I talked about works out. I'm staying with the academic example in practice. This is an image, an impression, sorry, a model of how an ideal university might work. And you can take the same model for this could be, for example, a hospital, or it could be a law practice or a consulting partnership, where you have a professional body doing professional group of work, that's on the left-hand side here, who are working to professional values and a sense of identity around the professional work they're doing. Here it's called academics, but this could be medical values and identities, for example, clinical values and identities, if we're talking about a hospital. And on the right-hand side, you have the institutional tasks and processes that are needed to maintain the whole organization. So in a university, you have academic management and academic leadership required. And these all contribute to a common purpose, goals, and objectives in which individual members of staff exercise self-leadership. They exercise these disciplines of the self, which I just previously, in order to do their professional work. And I'm sure you can see how this model works also in medicine and hospitals and so on, where doctors and nurses and physiotherapists, radiotherapists, nutritionists, and so on, all share in their professional values and identities in a common purpose and goals and objectives, and contribute in the dotted line both to management and to leadership of their institution. And this, however, is more of the felt experience of this kind of institution. Now, what's happening I'm going to take you through this slide in some detail. What's happening in higher education is that, because you see the big brown triangle coming in, this is because of global market forces and the constraints on educational resources, and the competition that's entering the market. There's more and more emphasis on sustaining the institution, on the university. And again, you can say the same for sustaining the hospital, or sustaining the health organization, the company, or sustaining a law practice. It's very much the same. That the emphasis on the brand and their market positioning and their rankings drives more and more emphasis on processes and tasks, corporate goals and objectives, performance management. So shifts around that anti-clockwise cycle to the right of the slide. And what becomes squeezed and at risk are the professional values and identities and the professional purposes, which become in danger of splitting off from those of the corporation. So I'm sure that in your coaching work and your facilitation work, you will often have come across professionals who feel that their professional values and their professional sense of vocation and purpose is in conflict with their employing organization. And this is why it's happening. This chart describes that process. It's the same, as I say, it's the same in many different sectors. Now, and what of course is happening is that the ability of the space for professionals to take authority, to practice their disciplines of self and work together to reinforce these values and purposes becomes compromised by this conflict. And a common response to this is to introduce leadership development programs. And you can see along the bottom, I've written commitment, direction, and alignment. And these are three very well-established and well-known definitions of leadership development. Leadership development should institute a common sense of direction, shared direction, a shared alignment to corporate strategies, and an overall to those strategies and to the organization. Now, what happens in this process that we're talking about here is that the middle managers and the professional staff who are drawn leadership development find that actually the priority is about alignment, about aligning with the corporate goals and objectives and the corporate performance management processes. And a lot of leadership development is really training in performance management and some degree of alignment with the targets that have been set. And so, as you can see, the experience that many people have of leadership development is that it's really about obedience rather than commitment. It's about targets rather than a direction. And what is meant by leadership becomes just alignment. Really, it's followership. And this is certainly my own experience as a participant in leadership development programs in my own university here in the UK. And many people have affirmed that this is a common experience. And I think it's something that we don't usually pick up in when we do evaluations of leadership development programs, not in the workshop feedback, but it underlies the ambivalence about giving proper feedback. Now, what to do about it? So what is happening here is that in this diagram, the right-hand side of running the institution becomes, everything becomes an instrumental in making this happen. And and the focus on those individualized pleasures of power becomes more and more. So managing the performance system, performance management system, contributing to the establishment and the alignment of corporate targets and objectives is becomes itself it feeds those pleasures we described before. But what has got lost is that almost all professional institutions, probably all professional institutions, have kind of dual identities. They have the institution, the organization itself, represented by this tower block, and they have the actual work itself, which are the values that people are expressing through their professional work, whether that is consulting or whatever. This is represented by this photograph of my bookshelf here, which you can see behind me actually in the picture. So as we've seen, leadership of the institution, it was really management of the institution, is often not the same as leadership of the actual work, and in that leadership of the work, people look to their colleagues and they're really their early career mentors and influencers very often. Now here's a couple of examples of how this works in medicine. This is, I think, a wonderful photograph. I hope the quality of the image is good enough there for you to see the picture on the screen. It's a photograph of a painting, also from the, I think, 1860s, this one by Luke Files, of a doctor watching his patient, a child who has come through the night and is still alive. She survived it. But there's nothing more he can do. No more medicine, no more techniques, no more interventions, other than to watch with care and diligence. And you can see, I hope you can see, if the picture is good enough for you, in the background, the father and mother of this child, exhausted in the background after the night, and the light just coming from the dawn. Now, what a health system has to do is to provide the conditions in which this kind of care is possible. The health system, the managed system, the management of the institution cannot do this kind of caring itself, but it has to provide the circumstances for the professional, the doctor, to do good work. So when I spoke about this dual identity, this is what it means in practice. There has to be the provision of the health system and the resources, but there has to also be the leadership of the normative orientation, the work, the normative work, the values. And we can see this same process is at work where it's effective, and it is effective in many places. Here in this picture, which is a modern painting of UN medical staff responding to the Ebola crisis in West Africa 2 years ago. And it's a very similar picture in some ways to the previous one, where we have, of course, all the interventions that can be made are made. And the medical staff now here watching and hoping that this man will survive and see it through. And with the technical construction of this hospital bed, of the isolation ward, of all the clothing they're wearing, and the equipment in the background, is evidence of a well-managed system, which is enabling this care to take place. So what we require in our organizations is these two systems to be able to work together. But not surprisingly, many of the people who work in the organization feel it comes down to them personally to integrate these two parts into one whole. They have to hold their professional values and somehow play a part in, contribute to, or maybe just survive the crazy managers. You remember that list I gave you before of the two-sided aspects, the double ways in which people see their bosses. So how do people do that? Well, I think there are some other pleasures that people take in different kinds of power actually happening within organizations. And these are them. People speak about the pleasure of connecting with other people, with being in meaningful relationships with people around work. This is a pleasure in itself. It's not just pleasurable because it makes us better workers. It is pleasurable. It makes people feel good. And this is measurable in oxytocin levels in the brain. We can see this, that when people are connecting with others in teams and in good communities of colleagues, the oxytocin levels in the brain increase and happiness increases. People get pleasure from representing a team and us. So as a team leader or representative, or speaking as a delegate on behalf of an us, that sense of being part of and expressing values, aspirations, goals, which are more than just individual interests, is itself a pleasure. There's pleasure in something, creating something complex and evolving, which is different to achieving objectives or goals. It's about actually building and sustaining something like a community or a long-term set of projects. So it's where the emphasis on program rather than project comes from. There's a pleasure in that kind of more complex creation. And people get pleasure from having an impact and contributing to values that transcend themselves. So something beyond themselves, something more than themselves, gives people pleasure. And similarly, fostering, developing a community or a network that has more power and more leverage in itself is pleasurable. The feel that one is developing a community that can influence. And this, of course, is because this is counter to the alienation and the nihilism, the negativity that was expressed in that early slide I showed of people's dreams being cancelled. So this is a picture which represents that kind of process. This for me represents coaching ourselves, where people get together and talk and are really able to relate together and connect. And it's by the Belgian artist Nora Clays. And I think it's a lovely picture expressing the kind of values of coaching ourselves. So what we're concerned with is leadership practices that foster the pleasurable power of connecting. And I'm just going to give you a quick example. There's a coaching ourselves technique or aspect called friendly consulting. And in friendly consulting, we invite someone to present a challenge they're facing and then have a very structured process by which they are able to collectively get some interest. I'm going to show you some pictures of someone doing this. This is someone, she was the director of nursing for a large group of hospices where people go to die. And she had many different hospices, many different residents. She was constantly dealing, of course, with a lot of anxiety and difficulties from patients and their families and from her own staff. And you can see at the beginning of this process, as she starts presenting, how stressed and weary, how tired she looks. And here she is presenting her case in this structured process to a consultant, who's the guy sitting there with a stripy shirt who's listening to her, and the other members of the group are sitting here. So this is a process in which her own burden, her problem, is becoming a collective and socialized one through this technique. She's presenting it here to him. And here she's responding to some specific questions. You can see in her face how engaged she is, but how anxious she still is about what's going to happen to this. But she's really deeply in describing the intricate nature of this problem that is hers, and that always in her managerial experience previously, if she's had a problem, it's been dealt with by her and her line manager. And now here she is discussing it in a collective coaching ourselves environment. Here now, these are the people as my younger self discussing this, what we've heard in her case and what we heard from this. She, meanwhile, sits on the edge of the circle with her back to us, just hearing our discussion. So she's now free to listen to what we think about it. So we, the group, have taken on some responsibility to think about and bring some insight to the situation. And here in this picture, you can see the circle of friendly consultants sitting around together discussing what we've heard in her case, while she's sitting in the window with her back to us, listening to what's going on. And here we are talking about the case we've just heard. As you can see, lots of people are coming in here with different perspectives, with different ways of thinking about it, pointing things out, looking at the picture she's drawn, wondering about it. And she's just sitting there listening to us in the background, while lots of different perspectives of people from different points of view are coming. And here she is coming back in the final phase of this exercise, reporting on what she's heard. And look how different her face is. Look how her situation now seems so different to her. This is a transformed person. And it's not because she's been given a solution from some technical expertise. It's because she's experienced the pleasure of the collective work on the managerial challenge she faces. So these collective pleasures are very real and also very effective. And this is what coaching ourselves is all about, and why it is so very important that we bring into our organizations these kinds of practices. If we don't, we're going to end up like Napoleon, contemplating a world in which the tide has gone out. Thank you very much. That was what I wanted to say.
Jonathan, thank you very much. That was really powerful. Take a second and contemplate what you've mentioned.
Can you see my face now on the
We see you and Napoleon there in the background.
Right, I'm in good company. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, well, listen. Very powerful, and I think it'd be very valuable if we just hear some thoughts from people here about how they feel about what you've mentioned and in their own context. In the organizations which everyone here works, are we seeing this type of connective work, or are we seeing the cascading model that Jonathan's talking about? Why don't we start with João Cabral? Vivi, last night we were talking about some challenges that we're facing.
Yeah. Hi, Jonathan. I can see you here.
Hi.
Well, thank you for sharing all those thoughts and information with us. It's very, very inspiring. Of course, that we face this situation here at FDC as well. And we keep reflecting on that, about how much does the management structure really reinforces the situation to have all these power things, and how much is that aligned to the beliefs, the values, and the really the human and best side of each person. So it's from our side, from our perspective, I think it's something that, yes, we do experience, and we are struggling to find the best solution to really get the best from each person that we have here.
So I think it would be an appropriate time to sort of share some things that are going on. Maybe we can use it, and maybe Jonathan, you can sort of provide us with your advice. So João Cabral historically has done these customized programs that are heavily customized. It's not particularly necessarily in the really competitive world cost effective. We have program directors who spend a lot of time listening and diagnosing and then coming up with customized solutions. The challenge is that organizations want very heavily customized programs, which we can't necessarily do cost effectively. And so we're starting to, I think, have to strategically, maybe that's not the right word, migrate to a model where we are able to 80, 70% of the time come up with something that's fairly specific to, say, a leadership challenge or something. But there's the desire on the part of our program directors to customize everyone. And I don't think we can do this cost effectively. And yet internally, I don't think we're necessarily connecting or creating this practice view by our program directors to come up with these solutions and use this kind of connecting power. So my question is, we've got a number of people who really practice, which module of coaching ourselves would an organization like João Cabral benefit from with this approach? I don't know if Jonathan wants to come in on it, but it's certainly something that there are these competitive pressures, but we also have these amazing professionals. And clearly, if we can connect and create this pleasure from the power of connecting, we can become a stronger organization as well. Right, Jonathan?
Well, I can respond, but maybe it's better to hear what other people have to say first. And shall I come back?
Anyone?
It's Ekaterina or Katya Timokhina. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello.
Yes. First, I should admit that I had the pleasure of growth just listening to what you were delivering, and it's really exciting to look at coaching ourselves and at power from pleasure's point of view. I never described it in these terms, I would say. And in a funny coincidence is that just yesterday, together with Phil, we did a podcast talking about friendly consulting format. How does it work? And a week ago, I had a case when I used it in the training format, in emotional intelligence part, where we had a module on stress, and I suggested that participants just teach each other how to deal with their stressful situations in the bank. And we had a case giver who provided a case and then said, well, you will not teach me anything because nobody can teach me anything. It's my case. I don't know why he suggested to volunteer to be a case giver, but this was his state in the beginning. And then after they talked behind his back, I saw that his face changed completely. And I asked him how he is. He said, well, I didn't find the solution. And I commented that it's obvious if there is a quick solution, he would find it himself because he's a good manager. And then he agreed, and he said that there were some things useful, but it's not, as you said, about useful, it's about connection. And when people talk about you and then dedicate their full attention to your case, and they're listening and they're interested. And I think this is a very unique experience for most of our managers participants. So they really have this oxytocin in them after that.
A big chocolate bar, yes.
Do you have an article on this research? Because I'm intrigued to read about it on paper. Do you have it in kind of paper or white paper?
I've just got a very short 2-page piece on the pleasures of power, which I'm still refining, but I'll make it available as soon as that's done.
Yes.
But I have a lot more on the dual organization.
Thank you. I'm waiting. And is it possible to get the presentation?
Sure.
Thank you. Okay. That's perfect.
Just commenting. Hello, Professor. My name is Irlana. And
Hi, Irlana.
E até ali. Oh, my. Okay, so now you see me?
I see you.
I see you too. Nice to see you. So what I was trying to articulate here while I was listening is that it's interesting because we are a particular kind of organization. We are in advertising and digital and technology business. So we have these two realities living together. We have the traditional top-down perspective of the leadership, but we also are a company made by basically our mass of middle management, junior management, and the staff are millennials. And this is totally different. So because we already have this demand to create a community and to lead in a different way, and to be different managers. So we are a group of a big group with many operations, and we have 2 generations of leaders there inside. So we are at this exactly moment with the 2 realities installed inside of the organization, which made me think even more about how appropriate is the coaching ourselves to bring this together eventually.
Yes. Yes. I think very appropriate. Thank you.
Thanks. I do have Jonathan, can you hear me?
Yes.
It's John over here. You can't see me from this. I'm really fascinated about something because I think there's a dilemma, there's an issue, which is a lot of organizations have this cascading mentality, and the people, the line managers, really are not interested, from what I can see, in necessarily trying to contribute to their organization by creating this type of organizational commitment, what you're speaking of. And I think really specifically, my wife's a cancer radiologist at a cancer hospital in Canada. It's a university hospital. And the big thing there is they don't have enough cancer radiologists. And so they always have a huge backlog of exams to read. And honestly, the physicians stay there. My wife rarely leaves before 10 or 11 at night, just because if she doesn't get those exams done the next day, the patients aren't going to change their chemotherapy protocols or what have you. And I know that, listening to her, that at the physician level, there's a huge desire to create this kind of change. And you do have this model, the double model, where these physicians are committed to patient care, they've got an oath, and yet the physicians that manage this and look at the numbers are focused only on making sure that those exams are read. It's not about creating the process. So within coaching ourselves, how is it that individuals and organizations that want to have this type of, pleasurable power of connecting, to come up with solutions to provide that kind of model that you showed in that painting of the physician after a long night with a patient? How can they use coaching ourselves, even if the superiors are still interested in the cascade model?
Yes. Okay. Are there any more comments, or shall I respond to those so far? Any other comments? Okay. I'll maybe respond to each of those, and perhaps start with the last one, and that I think relates to the experience of friendly consulting that somebody described as well. I think that, one of the issues is that there are already many situations in which some groups obtain the pleasures of connecting, but they're usually in liminal spaces outside the main organizational or management process. So in the locker rooms where the cleaners get changed, or in the senior staff canteen, if there is one, or restaurant, or in the nurse's room at the end of the ward in the hospital. These are the places where people connect, they tell jokes, they express some care for each other, perhaps they tell a bit of the story and give a bit of informal advice to each other on how to deal with difficult things. But the managerial process of the organization are so individualized and so focused on individual performance management that they constantly drive those locations of collective pleasures into the margins. They're seen as wasteful. But what coaching ourselves does is bring them into the open and allows people to manage collectively by connecting, and in doing so, it harnesses the power of that collective pleasure into managerial processes that strengthen the ability of people to support each other and to take on self-leadership and their leadership and management roles for the institution. And I think the example of the friendly consulting case with one person who didn't want to present a project because he thought he knew it all already, but afterwards felt so good for having done it, is this sense that we know from all that we're about psychology and the building up of self-esteem is that this comes not from somebody telling us how great we are, but from us performing who we are in the sight of unconditional positive regard, is the psychological jargon for it. That somebody is looking at us with great care and interest and love even, but non-judgmentally, just enjoying the fact that we are performing. And this, we know, is how children grow and develop. And it's the same for all of us in work. And much too much performance management is completely the opposite to that. It's judgmental from the beginning. And it's really only in those marginal spaces that are pushed towards the edges of organizational legitimacy that this being accepted in the regard of others, of one's peer group, one's colleagues, in their view, to do things right, to work out how to do things right. So I think what coaching ourselves, if it's instituted in an organization, becomes a location for that to happen. And I can give you an example from my own experience at Exeter University. We went through a few years ago a major transformation process, the aim of which was to cut 25% from staff costs and reallocate that money to new areas of investment, amongst them the medical school, actually. And one of the key target areas were older, more expensive, and more resistant to change professors. So I was one of the targets for that. And sure enough, in spite of all my training and education in this area, I felt furious about this change. I felt that it was going to destroy the spirit of the university. It was an attack on the centuries of academic values embedded in the independence of the professoriate and so on. And I was locked into a resistant and conflictual place. But one of the HR managers had previously introduced coaching ourselves to the university. It wasn't through me. I was a little bit involved with it, but it wasn't. I didn't introduce it. The HR person came across it independently and contacted Phil, and they started using coaching ourselves in the university. And in the midst of all this transformational change, I went and participated in a coaching ourselves group, and we sat around the table and we went through the topic on transformational change, 2 different models of transformational change. And as we talked about it, of course, I'm very familiar with the material and the content, but what I was not familiar with was how this topic was experienced and thought about by people from other parts of the university, people in IT services, student services, people who are junior academics. And in the discipline setting of the Coaching Ourselves session, they could speak out about their experience of this change. And I was amazed and humbled by how many, in particular of younger people, were really positively excited about this change. They saw it as opening up possibilities for them of unlocking the rigidities of the old system. That the very fact that we can make a decision to say, okay, we're going to change, we're going to cut from some areas and put them into others, and we have a management that is able to make those choices and to do it. This was, for me, a revelation that I had got stuck into a way of seeing things. That was not, I didn't have to be there. And by affirming my membership of this much wider community of the university, I was able to reintegrate those two halves, the two lines, the managerial line and the professional line. So I can personally speak to how coaching ourselves is a hugely effective managerial intervention in that transformation process, as well as being great fun. Yeah, and I think that probably addresses also Elana's comments about the advertising organization, that I think this is a tremendous way of giving voice to the hopes and aspirations and energy of millennials and younger staff in an organization, a mixed group. You spoke earlier on, I think it was John, and maybe someone, about the customization in executive education, and I think this is a slightly different set of things. But I mean, one of the things that customization is often driving at, it comes back to the point I made before, it's really aiming for alignment. When they say we want this customized, what they often mean is we want this program to serve the alignment of the organization with its corporate objective. So I think it would be excellent if FTC is able to respond to this with saying, yes, we will customize it. We'll customize it through providing spaces and opportunities for staff across the system to express what they're doing, what their own perspectives are, and to participate from their own perspectives through these collective means. And I think when people come to experience those kinds of pleasures and feel empowered for it and able to do something, you are beginning to transform the organization from its inner nature.
Fantastic, John. Thank you. Busily writing notes.
Yes.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions?
Just one comment.
Professor, hello, Erlan again. And now with my hat as a teacher from the school and a facilitator of coaching ourselves. And now just building on the insights you just proposed right now, when the companies that are our clients are asking for customization, what they really mean at the end of the day is about organization's agenda alignment. This is an amazing insight for us. I saw that review was taking note about that too. We connected at that time, and yes, it is. It's all about alignment and really coaching ourselves. We see the tool through this perspective would be very helpful to understand and to get the right opportunities to use the tool and to use much more the tool in our programs than we are using right now, I think. So this is a great insight for us.
Good.
Thank you.
Yeah, John, I'm just going to repeat what your line said. The big focus of this meeting that we're going.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I just want to kind of reiterate or focus on what Irlanda is saying. One of the big focuses of what we're trying to do here, at the end, we've got a session as a group to try and explore how we can take coaching ourselves in Brazil in this partnership with FDC and coaching ourselves to the next level. And this type of discussion is a really useful starting point for the discussions that we're hoping to have later on today. Sorry you can't be here with us for that session. Certainly, we'll make sure you hear about what we discussed, right, Phil? Excellent. Listen, we've got a number of other things that we're going to work on today. So I'd like to, on behalf of everybody here, Jonathan, thank you so very much for taking the time to speak with us. The presentation was fantastic. I, too, look forward to seeing the two-page article or paper when it's done. And thank you again. Thank you again very much. And hopefully in years to come, we can get you down to Brazil to join us as well. We'll definitely seek out great opportunities.
I'd love to be there. Thank you. I'd love to come. Good luck. Have a great day.